The classroom was vast and alien in every way from the human perspective. The walls shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and breathe, and the air hummed with low vibrations that made the human feel slightly off balance, yet aware that he was expected to observe rather than interfere. He had been assigned to this class as an observer, a human placed among a collection of students from dozens of worlds, each one more exotic and strange than the last, and yet all of them shared the same intent, curiosity, and eagerness to learn about humans and how to defeat them. The human looked around slowly, taking in the students. Some of them had long tentacles that twisted and curled in restless anticipation. Others had multiple eyes that darted around with constant motion, and a few had wings folded neatly against their shoulders like armor. The diversity was staggering, yet in every gaze he detected something common, a mixture of arrogance and excitement, as if they believed that mastering this lesson would give them power over an entire species. The first instructor had already left the classroom, leaving a holographic projection to continue the lesson on tactics and weaknesses, and the human had been told to remain quiet, observe, take notes, and intervene only if the situation demanded it. He could feel the tension in the room. The aliens had been trained to think that humans were fragile creatures that could be manipulated easily, that strength alone could overcome them, and that patience was a waste of time. In this lesson they would learn how to kill a human. The human sat at the back of the room in a seat that seemed far too small for his frame, and watched carefully every movement, every expression, and every flicker of overconfidence in the students that could be their undoing. The holographic instructor began the lesson describing scenarios in which humans could be cornered, subdued, or eliminated. It moved through the motions of strategy, showing simulations of ambushes and trap setting, and the aliens followed eagerly, taking notes in ways that were physically impossible for a human to comprehend. The air was filled with a low chatter of voices as questions were asked in dozens of languages and answered. With precision, some students argued with the hologram. Some corrected it, and others simply absorbed every word silently. The human remained still, his eyes scanning his surroundings, noting which species were too impulsive, which relied on brute force, and which had a cunning that might actually make them formidable adversaries if properly guided. He noticed the Velrians, a species with 4 arms and sharp claws who had been practicing ambush techniques as if they had hunted humans their entire lives, yet their timing was predictable. Their movements lacked subtlety, and they relied too heavily on strength. The human's patience allowed him to recognize this flaw immediately. He saw the Larvaki, whose multiple eyes darted between notes and holograms, and yet when they tried to anticipate human reactions, they overcomplicated the scenarios, adding layers of variables that would never exist in reality. The human's mind cataloged every error, every misjudgment, every tiny crack in the confidence that the aliens carried with them like armor. He understood the danger that humans posed not in raw strength, but in patience, resilience, and unpredictability, qualities that the aliens dismissed entirely, and that they would learn too. Late as the lesson continued, the students began practicing simulated attacks using holographic humans projected into the air around them. The Velrians rushed in, swinging claws and arms without hesitation, but each strike was anticipated and countered by the hologram. And yet they failed to see the patterns themselves, their confidence unshaken. They believed they were improving while actually reinforcing their weaknesses. The human leaned back slightly, noting the eagerness in their faces, the arrogance in their postures, the way they laughed at small failures and assumed mastery long before it existed. He understood fully why he had been placed here, why the higher command had trusted him to observe, because only by waiting and watching could the truth be revealed. Hours passed in a blur of movement and discussion. The human remained silent, though inside his mind, he was already preparing the lesson he would deliver at the end of the class. The revelation that humans were not as easy to predict as the aliens believed, that patience, intelligence, and strategy could turn the tables on any aggressor. He noticed small moments of curiosity that the students did not even recognize, the way one Larvaki paused before making a decision, hinting at doubt, and how one Velrian tilted its head after a failed strike as if questioning the obvious. But they ignored these signs. They were too focused on learning how to kill humans to notice that they were being studied. The human allowed himself a small smile, knowing that in time every mistake would become a lesson for them, every overconfidence a trap, and every arrogance a step closer to understanding. By the end of the day, the aliens were exhausted but exhilarated, they believed. They had learned more than ever before, they had mastered techniques, they had observed weaknesses, and they felt ready to dominate humans in any encounter. The human waited until they celebrated, until they whispered to each other about their growing superiority. And then he prepared to speak because the first lesson had already been given silently. Through observation, the aliens did not realize that they were being tested, not on their ability to kill, but on their ability to perceive the unexpected. And the human had already seen every flaw, every overconfidence, and every error that would shape the lessons to come. He stood slowly, the room quieted for a moment as they sensed his presence. The air felt heavier and the colors on the walls shimmered, slightly slower. The human's eyes scanned the students once more, and in that moment he knew that patience would be his greatest weapon, that allowing them to think they were victorious was more important than any immediate correction, and that the first part of this story was only the beginning, that the true lesson had not yet begun, but was already written in every glance, every movement, and every heartbeat of the alien class. The human waited until the aliens had settled back into their seats, murmuring among themselves with excitement and pride, and then he began to speak, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight that drew every eye in the room. The students froze in a mixture of curiosity and caution. Some, instinctively, straightened their posture while others leaned forward as if trying to catch every word that would come from a human who they had been taught to underestimate. He began by asking a single question, a simple one, yet loaded with meaning. How would you defeat a human in a real encounter? The question echoed through the chamber in dozens of languages, and the students responded almost instinctively, offering answers that were rehearsed by simulations and theory. The Velrians suggested ambushes, and overwhelming force. The Larvaki spoke of intricate traps and psychological manipulation, and a few of the winged Eldari proposed attacks from above with precision strikes, all of them confident in their knowledge, in their superiority, in their ability to kill a human without a second thought. The human listened silently, nodding occasionally as if considering their points carefully, and in his mind he catalogued each suggestion, every detail and every flaw, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the reality. The truth that humans were not merely fragile creatures that could be dominated by brute force or cunning strategy. They were patient, relentless, adaptable, capable of observing and responding in ways that no alien simulation could ever truly replicate. He began to speak slowly, outlining scenarios that seemed mundane at first, describing humans in everyday situations. The aliens assumed he was conceding their point until he began to layer the details. The human's awareness, the human's perception of subtle signs, the human's ability to exploit overconfidence and impatience. The students began to fidget, unsure of how to respond, because nothing in their training had prepared them for this. They were not expecting insight. They were expecting weakness. They were expecting fear. And instead they found comprehension, a comprehension that revealed their own flaws. The Velrians shifted uneasily, realizing that their reliance on strength alone would be their undoing. The Larvaki exchanged glances, uncertain if they had even interpreted the human's words correctly, and the Eldari folded their wings tightly, trying to appear composed. While their minds raced to adjust to the new understanding, the human continued speaking, using examples drawn from observation, from experience, from the patience that only a species that had survived countless battles and impossible odds could possess. He described moments when humans had been outnumbered, yet emerged victorious, when traps had been sprung against them, yet they had survived, and when patience had turned every misstep of the aggressor into an advantage. The aliens listened intently, some skeptical, some anxious, and some with a growing sense of unease, because for the first time they understood that knowledge alone was not enough, that predicting a human required more than observation. It required understanding. It required humility. It required the acceptance that their assumptions could be wrong. He then shifted the lesson to practical exercises, but exercises that challenged their assumptions. He instructed the students to design an attack on a human, but with one condition: they had to account for patience and unpredictability, as if the human could see every move before it happened, and yet still respond in ways that no strategy could anticipate. The room erupted into chaos as theories were debated, rewritten, and discarded. The Valerians tried to rely on brute force, but every simulation they ran failed because the human had anticipated their overconfidence. The Larvaki tried intricate psychological traps, but the human found gaps in logic that made their plans collapse. And the Eldari attempted aerial attacks, but the human predicted patterns of movement and countered with timing that the aliens could not replicate. The students grew frustrated, their voices rising, their gestures becoming more frantic, and in their frustration, they began to understand the lesson that the human had been teaching without revealing it completely. The lesson that humans were not to be underestimated, that patience, intelligence, and adaptability could overcome any aggression, and that arrogance was the greatest weakness an alien could possess. Hours passed as the human guided them through subtle corrections, pointing out errors they had made in ways that did not embarrass or belittle them, but forced them to reflect on their failures. He allowed them to discover their own mistakes, and in doing so he ensured that the lesson would stick more deeply than any lecture ever could. The aliens began to argue less and observe more, taking notes not just of techniques, but of their own thought processes, recognizing bias and overconfidence that they had carried without realizing it. The humans saw the transformation slowly unfolding, a quiet humility, replacing overconfidence, a willingness to question assumptions replacing blind certainty, and a growing respect for the species they had been taught to dominate. At the end of the exercise, he asked them to step back and consider the implications of what they had learned, and the room was filled with silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of fear, but the thoughtful silence of realization. Each student contemplating the enormity of their misunderstanding, and for the first time they began to see humans not as fragile creatures to be conquered, but as intelligent, resilient, unpredictable beings capable of responding to any threat with patience and cunning that few species could match. The human's eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle changes in posture, in gaze, in the way the students were absorbing the lesson, not just with their minds but with a new understanding in their hearts. Finally, he allowed them a moment to speak their reflections, and the room erupted into a chorus of voices offering insights they had never considered before. The Valerians admitted the dangers of over-reliance on strength. The Larvaki discussed the importance of humility and observation, and the Eldari spoke of unpredictability and timing. Each revelation a testament to the human's patient teaching, and each realization a small victory that would shape the way they approached humans in the future. The human remained quiet, content to let them reach their own conclusions, because he knew that the greatest lessons were those discovered through self-reflection and struggle, not those given freely without effort. And as the final bell rang, signaling the end of the class, the aliens left the room exhausted but wiser, not because of a lecture, but because they had experienced the truth for themselves, and the human knew that the seeds of understanding had been planted. The first steps toward respect and caution had been made, and the story of the alien class and the humans' patience had truly begun. The aliens returned to their quarters after the intense lesson, their minds still buzzing with thoughts and strategies that had been challenged and overturned by the humans' patience and insight. They could not shake the feeling of unease mixed with admiration for the species that had just taught them the limits of their own understanding. They had come expecting superiority and domination, yet they had encountered a presence that had turned every expectation on its head. The Valerians huddled together, speaking in low tones, discussing every movement, every suggestion they had made, and how the human had anticipated and countered, without ever raising a hand in violence or showing aggression. They marveled at the discipline the Larvaki meticulously reviewed their notes, rewriting entire strategies, trying to incorporate the lessons about observation, unpredictability, and the patience of humans. They realized that their simulations had been shallow, and their confidence had been a dangerous illusion. The Eldari paced the high ceilings of their chambers, wings brushing against the walls as they replayed the human's calm voice in their minds. The subtle emphasis on timing, the way he had allowed them to reach their own conclusions, the way he had never forced them to see their mistakes, but guided them to discover the truth for themselves. It was a method alien to their species, yet profoundly effective, and they could not ignore the impact it had on their understanding of humans. Meanwhile, the human prepared for the next session. Knowing that the true test was not in theory but in practice, he intended to push the aliens further to see if they could internalize the lesson he had planted in them. He wanted to see if they could approach humans with the caution and respect that the first exercise had begun to teach, or if they would fall back into arrogance and overconfidence. He set up simulations that mimicked real-life situations. Humans often encountered situations where patience and adaptability were essential, and where rash decisions could lead to failure. He observed quietly as the aliens engaged in the exercises, their initial confidence giving way to careful calculation and observation. They hesitated more than before. They weighed every option, they considered every variable, and slowly but surely the changes he had been aiming for began to show. During the exercises, one of the Velrians suggested an ambush that would have worked under previous assumptions, but the human asked a simple question: how would you account for human unpredictability? And the Velrian hesitated. He realized he had no answer because he had been trained to assume the human would act within predictable parameters. The human then demonstrated the flaw without revealing the method of his response, forcing the Velrian to rethink and adapt the simulation. The Larvaki attempted to use psychological manipulation in another scenario, yet the human anticipated the patterns and subtly altered the conditions. The Larvaki found herself frustrated at first, but then intrigued. She began to consider alternative approaches. Timing, patience, observation, and flexibility became the focus of her strategy. The Eldari attempted an aerial assault in a third exercise. The human remained stationary at first, allowing them to take positions, and then reacted in a way that none of the Eldari had predicted, forcing them to retreat and reassess their understanding of speed and timing. The lesson was clear: humans were not defeated by strength alone, not by cunning traps alone, but by a combination of awareness, patience, and adaptability that exceeded anything the aliens had encountered in their studies. The room was filled with a tension that was different from fear. It was the tension of realization, the tension of understanding that their knowledge was incomplete, that their species' methods were not sufficient against the intelligence of humans. The human walked among them, observing their reactions, noting the shifts in posture, the furrowing of brows, the subtle changes in strategy, and he allowed the exercises to continue without interference. Each failure, a lesson; each adjustment, a small victory in their internal growth. He remained a calm center in the storm of alien uncertainty, a living example of the principle he was teaching: patience, observation, and adaptability in action. The aliens began to discuss among themselves, not with arrogance but with respect, not with certainty but with curiosity. They shared ideas about humans and their abilities, speculated about scenarios, and for the first time considered the possibility that humans were not a species to be easily conquered, but a species to be respected and understood. As the final exercise of the day approached, the human gathered the students for reflection. He asked them to describe what they had learned, not just in words, but in understanding what changes had occurred in their thinking and approach. And one by one they spoke, admitting flaws in their assumptions, acknowledging gaps in their knowledge, and expressing a newfound respect for human resilience and intelligence. The Velrians spoke of the danger of underestimating patience, the Larvaki of the necessity of observing subtle cues and patterns, and the Eldari of the unpredictability inherent in a species that had survived against overwhelming odds. The human nodded approvingly, knowing that the seeds of insight had been planted deeply within their minds, and that the next stage would be to ensure these lessons translated into real-world understanding and respect. The aliens left the chamber not with the arrogance of superiority, but with the cautious humility of learners who had glimpsed the depth of human capability. That night the human reflected on the session, knowing that change would not come instantly, that pride and preconceptions were difficult to overcome, but also knowing that patience had been planted, that curiosity had been sparked, that understanding had begun to grow. And in his mind he planned the next series of lessons exercises that would challenge assumptions, further test patience and adaptability, and reinforce the understanding that humans were a species to be approached with caution, intelligence, and respect. He was confident that if the aliens continued to engage with the lessons in the spirit of learning, that by the end of their training, they would not only understand humans better, but also approach interactions with a wisdom they had never possessed before. and the story of the human correcting the alien class continued to unfold. The next morning, the human returned to the training chamber earlier than usual. The aliens arrived in a state of quiet anticipation, their minds still heavy with the lessons of the previous day, but also alive with curiosity and a new kind of tension. They had never felt before a mix of excitement and caution that made them move with calculated precision rather than reckless confidence. The humans surveyed the room, noticing the subtle changes in posture, the way the Velrians carried themselves. Differently now, the way the Larvaki whispered strategies among themselves, the careful observation, the deliberate planning. The Eldari wings folded tighter, as if containing their eagerness. The exercises for today were designed to test their understanding, under stress to push them beyond their comfort zones and force them to confront the unpredictability of humans in real scenarios. The human had created a series of simulations that combined environmental challenges, physical obstacles, and psychological variable scenarios where mistakes could be costly, and success depended not on raw strength but on strategy, observation, and timing. The first exercise began with a mock urban environment simulated with holographic projections and moving targets. The aliens approached with their usual strategies, attempting to predict movements and plan ambushes. The human observed quietly from a distance, allowing them to act freely. The Velrians made the first move, assuming speed and surprise would guarantee success, but the human anticipated every motion. He adjusted the environment subtly, causing unexpected shifts in cover and line of sight, forcing the Velrians to adapt in real time, their initial confidence wavering as they encountered obstacles. They had not predicted the Larvaki tried to influence the actions of the Velrians using deception and psychological manipulation techniques, but found herself challenged by the human's subtle cues. He remained calm and observant, changing patterns of light, sound, and movement in ways that revealed their assumptions and forced them to reconsider strategy. Each adjustment tested patience and observation. Each reaction pushed them closer to understanding the human mind as a force unlike any other they had encountered. Meanwhile, the Eldari attempted an aerial assault over the cityscape projections, their wings carrying them with speed and precision. But the human's movements were unpredictable. He moved in ways that were not just reaction, but anticipation. He seemed to exist simultaneously everywhere within the scenario, adapting instantly to every attempt they made and every strategy they deployed. The Eldari found themselves forced to retreat and regroup, multiple times their usual, confidence eroding with every failed maneuver. The Velrians began to notice patterns not in the human's movements, but in his patience, in his observation, in the way he allowed them to think they had an advantage, only to subtly undermine their assumptions without ever appearing aggressive. It was a lesson far more powerful than physical combat. It was a lesson in humility, awareness, and respect for an intelligence that was patient and relentless. The Larvaki began to experiment with timing and coordination. She synchronized actions with others in a way that was tentative but growing more sophisticated. She noticed that rushing led to failure, patience led to insight, that observation led to advantage. The human stepped into the simulation. At a point where the aliens were attempting a coordinated ambush, he did not attack immediately. He allowed them to engage fully to reveal their methods and weaknesses, and then he demonstrated in subtle movements how easily a patient observer could adapt and counter without aggression. The aliens watched with a mixture of frustration and awe as their best strategies failed to achieve the desired outcome. They had never encountered a species that could absorb every action, every pattern, and turn it to advantage without a single strike of brute force. The human's calm composure and steady awareness revealed an entirely new dimension of power, one that relied on understanding rather than domination. They were learning that humans were dangerous not because of raw power, but because of intelligence, patience, and the ability to see beyond immediate appearances. After the exercise, the human gathered the aliens in a circle. He asked them to reflect on what they had observed. He did not allow answers to be vague or general. He pressed for specifics, each student describing what they had learned. The Velrians admitted that speed and surprise were not enough. They realized that humans observed patterns and waited. For mistakes, the Larvaki described the subtle shifts in the environment that revealed their assumptions, and the Eldari spoke of the need to anticipate beyond their normal comprehension limits. The human nodded approvingly, and said that understanding was the foundation of power, that patience and awareness were the weapons of the wise, and that underestimating a species because it appeared ordinary was the greatest mistake one could make. The aliens absorbed every word, understanding that their previous arrogance had been dangerous and that humans were not simply another prey species, but a force to be respected and studied carefully. The day continued with more complex simulations, each one pushing the aliens further, challenging their assumptions, testing their patience, and forcing them to adapt in real time. The human observed silently, allowing failure and success to teach the lessons he intended. Failure revealed arrogance, success revealed insight, and each moment added layers. To their understanding, they began to move as a cohesive unit. Yet each action was tempered with caution. They discussed strategies quietly among themselves, learning from mistakes, adjusting in ways they never had before. And slowly, the realization dawned that humans were not a species to be attacked lightly, that understanding them required observation, patience, and respect that the human had demonstrated with effortless control. As night fell, the aliens returned to their quarters exhausted and thoughtful, their minds spinning with lessons they could not ignore, their pride tempered by insight, their arrogance replaced with cautious curiosity. They discussed among themselves scenarios and possibilities, and for the first time considered humans as equals, not just as opponents. The human reviewed the day's sessions, knowing that the seeds he had planted were growing deeper and that the next stage would challenge them further still, to internalize the lessons fully and confront the ultimate understanding that humans were not defined by violence but by intellect, patience, and a will that could not be rushed or predicted. The story continued to unfold as the human prepared for the challenges yet to come. The following day, the human arrived at the training ground earlier than anyone else, and the aliens were already present, their minds still replaying the lessons of the previous day, trying to remember every movement, every subtle shift in light, sound, and pattern. The human began the session not with an explanation or demonstration, but with a simple challenge. He told them to navigate a terrain that appeared ordinary at first glance but contained hidden traps, pitfalls, and unexpected dangers. He instructed them to move carefully, to observe everything, to anticipate consequences, and to work together. Without rushing, the aliens looked at each other uncertainly. This was a level they had never faced before. The ground beneath them was uneven rocks, hidden under foliage, sudden drops simulated with holographic shifts, and unpredictable environmental variables that forced them to adjust constantly. It was a lesson not in attack or defense but in awareness, patience, and timing. The human walked among them silently, watching their movements, noting hesitation, overconfidence, and emerging patterns of thought. The Velrians were the first to engage, using speed and coordination as they had learned previously. But the terrain punished reckless movements, and they found themselves caught in minor traps, designed to teach attention to detail. They stumbled and faltered, and the human observed silently without intervening, allowing them to learn through consequence. The Larvaki used deception, attempting to manipulate the perceptions of others to gain advantage. But the human had adjusted variables, so that every attempt at trickery was exposed, revealing gaps in understanding and forcing the aliens to confront the limits of their assumptions. The Eldari tried aerial strategies, soaring above the terrain, using speed and agility to observe the ground from a higher perspective, but the human anticipated their movements. He changed visual cues, subtle vibrations in the ground, and shifts in the environment that caused the Eldari to miscalculate distances and timing. Each error was a lesson. In humility and insight, it became increasingly clear that their usual methods would not succeed, that their prior arrogance was no longer an advantage but a liability. As the day progressed, the human introduced scenarios where they had to make split-second decisions based on observation rather than instinct. One alien had to decide whether to take a route that appeared shorter but was filled with hidden dangers, while another had to determine when to act, to avoid exposing the group to risk. The human's presence was subtle, yet commanding. Every decision they made was influenced by his patient observation and anticipation. He never interfered directly, yet his strategies were everywhere, shaping outcomes and forcing the aliens to confront the unpredictability of human reasoning. The Velrians began to notice patterns in his calm demeanor, how he waited for mistakes, how he allowed them to believe they had advantage, only to reveal it gradually. At the moment it would teach the most valuable lesson, the Larvaki began to synchronize actions with the others more, carefully adjusting her strategies in real time, and the Eldari learned to anticipate beyond immediate visual cues using intuition, tempered by observation. Midway, through the exercises, the human initiated a complex simulation designed to test cooperation and trust. He created scenarios where mistakes by one alien could endanger the entire group and force them to communicate effectively and observe each other's actions. The Velrians struggled with the concept, at first their pride making it difficult. To rely on others, the Larvaki stepped in with guidance, but the human had already set conditions where even their attempts at coordination were challenged. Unexpected variables shifted routes and obstacles, forcing them to adapt constantly. It was chaos carefully controlled by the human to teach observation, patience, and reliance on intellect over strength. The Eldari discovered that cooperation did not diminish their power, but enhanced it, that understanding others' actions and motives allowed for far greater efficiency and effectiveness than brute force alone. By late afternoon, the aliens were mentally exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limit by the combination of physical and psychological challenges. They had learned more than they could articulate. Their assumptions about humans had been shattered, their previous arrogance replaced by cautious curiosity and growing respect. The human gathered them for reflection, asking questions not to test knowledge, but to guide. Understanding, he inquired about what they had noticed, patterns they had not seen, weaknesses in their own strategies. The aliens shared insights hesitantly at first, but as they spoke, they realized how much they had underestimated patience, observation, and adaptability. They began to understand that humans were not defined by power but by perception, intellect, and relentless persistence. The final exercise of the day was unexpected. The human instructed them to navigate a scenario where success depended entirely on timing, observation, and deduction, with no opportunity for direct confrontation. They had to move through an environment that appeared simple but constantly shifted, subtly based on their actions. Every step revealed new information. Every hesitation could be costly. The Velrians relied on speed but learned that rushing led to error. The Larvaki attempted manipulation, but discovered the subtle patterns of the human, anticipated deception, and countered instinctively. The Eldari tried aerial observation but found the environment deceptive, constantly changing based on their approach. Each failure was instructive and each success fleeting. The human remained calm, guiding the lesson not with words or force, but with presence and insight. As night fell, the aliens returned to their quarters, weary, thoughtful, and transformed. The Velrians admitted they had never encountered a species so patient and observant. The Larvaki reflected on how manipulation alone could not overcome understanding, and the Eldari spoke of the importance of timing, perception, and anticipation. They realized the human had not merely corrected them, he had reshaped their thinking, their understanding of humans, and perhaps even their approach to all intelligent species. They could no longer see humans as ordinary creatures to be dominated. They understood that intelligence, patience, observation, and insight could surpass any physical advantage, that the story unfolding before them was more than a lesson in combat. It was a lesson in respect, humility, and the limitless potential of human perception. And they waited silently, knowing that tomorrow the human would take them even further, challenging everything they thought they knew about strategy, awareness, and the essence of power. The next day dawned with a pale light spilling over the jagged training grounds. The aliens arrived cautiously, their minds still replaying the lessons of the previous day. Each step measured, each movement considered, and their pride tempered by growing respect. They found the human already waiting, not in the usual uniform of authority, but simply observing the terrain. He had prepared a scenario unlike anything they had faced before. It was a labyrinth of shifting walls, concealed hazards, and unexpected openings, an environment that forced constant adaptation and observation. The human explained nothing. At first only gestured for them to enter and watch their reactions carefully. As the aliens moved into the labyrinth, confusion quickly replaced confidence. The Velrians attempted their usual tactics, relying on speed and brute force, but the shifting walls and hidden pitfalls rendered those methods useless. At every turn, they were forced to stop, think, and reassess. The Larvaki tried subtle manipulation using illusions and perception tricks, but the human had designed the environment so that every trick revealed itself, eventually leaving her exposed and frustrated. The Eldari soared above the terrain, attempting to anticipate changes from above. But the labyrinth had layers invisible to normal sight, and every observation required interpretation, deduction, and careful timing. It was a test of awareness, patience, and intelligence all at once. The human observed silently, noting hesitation, overconfidence, and emerging strategies. He allowed the aliens to make mistakes, knowing that each error would teach them far more than words ever could. He introduced unpredictable elements without warning. A section of the ground would tilt, forcing balance and coordination. The lighting would shift, creating deceptive shadows and distortions. The air currents would change subtly, affecting movement and sound. Every detail tested their perception, their adaptability, and their ability to communicate effectively under pressure. At first, the alien struggled, the Velrian stumbled repeatedly. The Larvaki found her illusions backfiring, and the Eldari misjudged distances repeatedly. Yet the human did not intervene. He simply watched, his presence commanding yet calm, allowing them to learn through experience. Hours passed and the aliens began to adjust. They started noticing patterns in the labyrinth. How shifts in one section affected another. How timing and observation could reveal safe paths. They began to communicate effectively, pointing out hidden traps, warning each other of potential hazards, and learning to anticipate both the environment and the moves of their peers. The Velrians realized that speed alone was no longer enough, that caution and observation were equally critical. The Larvaki discovered that deception had limits, and that understanding the rules of reality mattered more than bending perception. The Eldari understood that observation required interpretation and timing rather than mere vision. The labyrinth had become a teacher, revealing their weaknesses and guiding them toward insight. Midway through the exercise, the human introduced a new layer, a simulated threat that appeared suddenly and unpredictably, an enemy that seemed to have superior strength and tactics. Yet its movements were deliberate and observable to those who paid attention. He did not announce the threat, he simply allowed it to emerge, forcing the aliens to react intelligently rather than instinctively. They discovered that rushing to attack led to failure. That observation, patience, and coordinated action yielded success. They adapted together, moving in synchrony, the Velrians leading cautiously, the Larvaki manipulating situations to benefit the group, and the Eldari observing from multiple perspectives, interpreting the environment and the threat. Each alien relied on the others, yet each also relied on the lessons the human had instilled in them, their minds expanding beyond prior limitations. As the exercise continued, the environment became increasingly chaotic, shifting unpredictably. The human had anticipated every response and adjusted the labyrinth in real time. The aliens faced scenarios where every decision mattered and mistakes had consequences. They began to understand the depth of human intelligence, how observation, patience, and anticipation could outmatch even raw power and advanced abilities. Every movement they made was scrutinized by their own growing awareness and by the presence of the human, who remained calm and commanding yet never intrusive. It was a lesson in humility, insight, and the limitless potential of perception. By late afternoon, the aliens were exhausted mentally and physically, yet transformed. Their thinking had shifted, their understanding of humans from mere physical beings to creatures whose patience, intellect, and perception created advantages far beyond their apparent strength. The Velrians admitted their pride had blinded them. The Larvaki reflected on the limits of manipulation and illusion, and the Eldari recognized that observation without interpretation was meaningless. They began to see patterns, not only in the labyrinth but in each other, in themselves, and in the human who had orchestrated it all. They understood that humans did not rely on physical dominance alone, but on foresight, insight, and relentless persistence. As the sun set, the human gathered them and asked them to reflect not on failure or success but on what they had learned, their insights, their observations, their moments of doubt and revelation. They shared hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, realizing how much their understanding had deepened, how much their assumptions had been challenged, and how much respect they had gained for the species they had once underestimated. The human listened silently, nodding occasionally, allowing them to discover the truth themselves, that humans were not creatures to be measured by strength alone but by patience. perception, intellect, and the ability to anticipate, adapt, and overcome in ways that transcended physical prowess. By the time night fell, the aliens returned to their quarters weary, thoughtful, and changed forever. They understood that the lesson was more than a challenge. It was a demonstration of the limits of arrogance and the power of insight, that humans had mastered the art of patience, observation, and adaptation, that every action could be anticipated, every mistake could be corrected, and every opponent could be understood through intelligence and perception. The Velrians, the Larvaki, and the Eldari lay awake contemplating the human and the lessons of the labyrinth, knowing that tomorrow would bring the final exercise and that the true extent of human mastery was yet to be revealed. The final day arrived with a weight in the air heavier than any physical obstacle. The aliens approached the training grounds, cautiously aware that today, the human would not merely observe or test, but reveal the full measure of his lesson. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the landscape, exaggerating every ridge and hollow and hiding every subtle change. The Velrians moved as one, slower than usual, aware that haste could be their undoing. The Larvaki's eyes scanned every detail, calculating and reconsidering each move, while the Eldari hovered silently, interpreting the terrain from above, every feathered motion precise and deliberate. The human stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, a quiet authority radiating from him, not commanding but present, a constant reminder of the intellect that had orchestrated every previous challenge. The labyrinth of yesterday seemed simple compared to what lay before them today. Massive shifting walls, unpredictable terrain, hidden traps, and a simulated enemy whose strength rivaled the most powerful among them, yet moved with uncanny predictability. To those who observed carefully, the human said nothing, merely nodded toward the entrance of the challenge, signaling that it was time for them to act. The aliens stepped forward cautiously, their minds sharper than ever, remembering every lesson, every mistake, every insight. As they moved, the simulated enemy emerged, and immediately the aliens noticed the subtleties that had once gone unseen. Its movements calculated, yet constrained by predictable patterns that could be exploited by those who paid attention. The Velrians hesitated, then acted in perfect synchronization, coordinating with the Larvaki's manipulations of the terrain and the Eldari's observations from above. Every attack, every maneuver was calculated, every movement a reflection of the lessons learned. The human watched silently, noting hesitation, confidence, teamwork, and understanding that the final exercise was not about victory or defeat, but comprehension of human superiority in perception, patience, and strategic foresight. The enemy struck repeatedly, but the aliens adapted instinctively, their awareness heightened to an almost unbearable degree. Every motion of the enemy anticipated and countered, yet they realized that anticipation alone was insufficient without insight into motive, intention, and timing. The human had not merely trained them to react, he had trained them to understand, to see beyond the obvious, to comprehend the layers of intelligence that allowed a single human to command, observe, and adapt in ways that transcended brute strength. The Velrians felt frustration tempered by admiration. The Larvaki's illusions became tools to guide rather than deceive, and the Eldari's observations became keys to unlock patterns invisible to any other. Hours passed with unrelenting intensity. The labyrinth shifted continuously. New obstacles, new traps, and subtle hazards emerged, constantly testing their adaptability. Coordination and insight fatigue began to creep into their muscles and minds, yet every alien recognized that exhaustion could not equal failure. Intelligence, observation, and patience were far stronger than mere physical weariness. The human introduced final, unpredictable elements. Without warning, a section of the terrain collapsed, revealing another enemy that seemed stronger than the first. Yet every movement, every weakness, every opportunity could be read by those who had truly learned the lesson. The aliens hesitated for only a heartbeat before acting as one entity. Each understanding the other's intentions, the Velrians led, shielding and guiding. The Larvaki manipulated the environment with precision to favor strategy over raw power, and the Eldari analyzed continuously, communicating without words, predicting, interpreting, and revealing the hidden patterns of threat and opportunity. The human observed quietly, seeing not only their actions but their comprehension, the culmination of every lesson taught, every mistake corrected, and every insight gained. It was not simply a test of skill, but a revelation that humans could dominate not by strength or speed, but by intelligence, perception, patience, and adaptability. Finally, the last enemy was neutralized, the labyrinth stabilized, and the alien trio stood, exhausted, yet transformed in ways they could not yet fully articulate. Their minds expanded their understanding. Of humans, their arrogance tempered, their curiosity ignited. They turned to the human, expecting reprimand, praise, or explanation. Yet the human merely nodded and gestured toward the horizon, indicating that the lesson was complete. It was not about teaching how to kill or survive, but about understanding that human dominance came from the mind, from observation, adaptation, and anticipation rather than physical superiority. The Velrians, the Larvaki, and the Eldari bowed slightly, not out of fear, but respect and comprehension that the species they had once underestimated had far deeper reserves of skill, intellect, and strategic thought than they had imagined. The human spoke finally, not loudly, but with authority, explaining the purpose of every exercise, every labyrinth, every simulated enemy, how each was designed not to overpower them physically, but to challenge their perception, patience, and judgment, to reveal that humans were creatures who could endure, adapt, and prevail in ways that transcended their apparent limitations. As night fell, the aliens reflected on the journey from arrogance to respect, from confidence to comprehension, understanding that every moment of doubt, every hesitation, every insight had been a lesson not in failure but in growth, that humans were not creatures to be defeated merely through strength but understood, anticipated, and respected for their intelligence, patience, and ability to endure and adapt. The training had not broken them. It had expanded them, reshaped them, and revealed the true nature of the human mind. In the quiet that followed, the aliens understood that the lesson would remain with them forever, that humans were beings whose mastery lay not in brute force but in perception and insight, whose patience could outlast the strongest, and whose intelligence could overcome the most cunning. The Velrians, the Larvaki, and the Eldari left the grounds not as students, but as witnesses to human excellence, their respect absolute, their curiosity insatiable, and their understanding deepened beyond anything they had previously imagined. They had learned what no book or teacher could convey, that humans were creatures to be admired and respected. The human watched them depart, calm yet vigilant, knowing that the lesson was complete, that the aliens had learned not only the limits of their own arrogance, but the boundless potential of human intellect and perception, that in every observation, every act of patience, and every carefully calculated move lay a power that transcended simple strength. The story of the alien class and the human teacher concluded with respect, transformation, and revelation the aliens would never forget. And the humans had once again proven that their greatest weapons were their minds, their patience, and their ability to see beyond the obvious and the impossible. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the alien training grounds, and the air shimmered with heat and anticipation. The alien students moved silently, their muscles tired, but minds sharp, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, respect, and wonder as they approached the final challenge of the human's lesson. Every step they took seemed measured yet uncertain, because they knew that today was different. Today was not a test of strength or speed, but a test of understanding and insight. The human waited at the edge of the field, watching every movement with quiet patience, a calmness that seemed impossible after days of relentless teaching, of unending exercises, of traps, simulations, and lessons in observation, patience, and anticipation. The air was thick with tension and possibility, and the aliens could feel the weight of every choice, every motion, and every thought pressing upon them like an invisible force. They stepped into the arena together as one yet distinct, each aware of the other and of the challenge ahead. The terrain shifted beneath them, transforming constantly, revealing new obstacles and new threats. The Velrians sensed the danger with their keen instincts. The Larvaki manipulated the environment, subtly guiding the paths without forcing them. The Eldari soared above, scanning for patterns and predicting outcomes, all of them working in a harmony. born not of command, but of understanding of lessons learned and trust forged in the fire of relentless training. The simulated enemies moved with unpredictable intelligence designed to challenge everything the aliens thought they knew, and to force them to think beyond instinct, beyond reaction, beyond mere survival. The human did not interfere. Instead, he observed the unfolding chaos as the aliens adapted and adjusted their strategies continuously. Every movement precise yet fluid, every decision calculated yet flexible. The challenges became more complex and more demanding, and still they did not falter. They moved as one entity, each using the skills he had painstakingly taught them, each understanding the deeper lesson that killing a human or defeating an enemy was not about aggression but about awareness, anticipation, and patience. It was about seeing what others did not, noticing what others overlooked, and choosing the right moment to act rather than reacting out of impulse or arrogance. Hours passed like minutes, and finally the last obstacle revealed itself, a vast chasm with no bridge, no obvious way across. Yet the aliens paused only for a heartbeat before combining their talents to create a solution that none could have achieved alone. The Velrians used their strength. The Larvaki manipulated the terrain to create a pathway the Eldari coordinated from above, timing every motion perfectly, and together they crossed the final divide, overcoming the last challenge, not by brute force, but by comprehension, cooperation, and cleverness. The human nodded once, acknowledging their success, not with words but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing the lesson had been fully absorbed. The aliens stood on the far side of the arena, breathing heavily, their bodies exhausted, their minds buzzing with revelation. They turned to face the human and saw not only a teacher, but a being whose intellect, patience, and perception transcended their own expectations. They realized that everything they had learned was more than a lesson in combat. It was a lesson in humility, a lesson in respect, a lesson in understanding a species capable of mastering the unpredictable through observation, through insight, through willpower and patience. They bowed, instinctively, not in fear but in admiration, acknowledging that the human had revealed a truth they could not ignore, that humans were not merely creatures to be defeated, but creatures to be understood and respected. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the shadows of the aliens stretched long across the ground, and the human watched them silently, knowing that the impact of this day would last far longer than the memory of any battle or challenge the aliens had faced. They had been transformed, not physically but mentally and emotionally. Their perception widened, their appreciation deepened, and their respect became absolute. They had witnessed the extraordinary capability of a human mind to teach, to guide, to challenge, and to reveal a power that lay not in the body but in the intellect and spirit, and they would carry this knowledge forever. The night settled over the training grounds, and the aliens departed quietly, leaving the human alone in the fading light. He stood, watching them go with a calm certainty, knowing that the lesson was complete, that the impact of understanding had been made, that the respect earned would shape the future encounters between their species. And in that moment, the human allowed himself a faint smile, not of pride but of satisfaction, because he had done what he had set out to do. He had shown that patience, intelligence, observation, and wisdom could triumph over instinct, aggression, and arrogance, and that humans were beings whose true strength lay within the mind and spirit. The wind whispered across the deserted grounds, carrying with it the lessons learned, the respect earned, and the quiet echo of transformation. The end.